All right, so we're diving into some really fascinating stuff today. You guys have been sending in some really intriguing material about confidence and learning. And there's this one paper, When Confidence is Not a Signal of Knowing, that really got us thinking. Like that feeling you get when you're studying something and you think, okay, yeah, I've got this. But then later, maybe you realize, uh-oh, maybe not so much.
Yeah, that's a really common experience. And it's that disconnect between how confident we feel while we're learning and what we actually know that we're going to explore today.
So we're talking about those illusions of knowing, as the paper calls them. Those moments where we feel like we're cruising along, but it turns out we might not be grasping things as well as we thought.
Right. We often rely on this feeling of ease, this processing fluency, as a gauge of our understanding. When something feels easy to learn or recall, we naturally assume we've got it down. But the research shows that this feeling of fluency can be a bit of a trap. Sometimes the things that feel easy to learn are actually the ones that we forget most quickly.
Which is kind of counterintuitive, right? You'd think that if something feels easy to understand, it would stick with you.
It seems like it should, but our brains don't always work that way. And this is where things get really interesting for you as a learner. Because if you're relying too heavily on this feeling of fluency to judge your understanding, you might be setting yourself up for some surprises, especially when it comes to tests or applying what you've learned in real-world situations.
And the paper specifically highlights this problem of miscalibrated confidence.
Exactly. Miscalibrated confidence happens when our feeling of confidence doesn't match up with our actual knowledge. So we might be overconfident, thinking we know more than we do, or even underconfident, not recognizing how much we've actually learned.
And it's that overconfidence that can really trip us up when it comes to studying, right?
Absolutely. If you're feeling overly confident about your understanding, you might be less likely to put in the necessary time and effort to really master the material. You might skip over important practice or review, thinking you've already got it down.
The paper mentioned a study by Dunlosky and Rawson that really illustrates this.
Oh, that's a classic one. In that study, students who were overconfident about how well they knew the definitions of certain terms actually stopped studying sooner than those who were less confident. And you can imagine what happened, that they didn't perform as well on the later test because they hadn't put in the necessary effort to really solidify their learning.
So it's like a double whammy. Not only are you not studying effectively, but you're also not even aware that you're not studying effectively because you're feeling so confident.
It's a sneaky trap for sure. And what's really important to understand is that this isn't just a problem for young students or inexperienced learners. This tendency to overestimate what we know persists throughout adulthood.
So even experienced learners can fall prey to these illusions of knowing.
Absolutely. The research is quite clear on that. There are studies showing that even college students often overestimate their performance, and their self-assessments don't always align with their actual grades or their instructors' evaluations. It seems to be a pretty consistent human tendency to be a bit overconfident in our own knowledge.
Which is a bit concerning, to be honest. It makes you wonder how much we're all walking around with these inflated senses of what we actually know.
It's definitely something to be aware of. But the good news is that by understanding these biases, we can start to develop strategies to mitigate them. We can learn to question our own confidence and look for more reliable indicators of our understanding.
So let's dive a little deeper into these reliable indicators. The paper talks about two main types of fluency: encoding fluency and retrieval fluency.
Right. Encoding fluency is that feeling of ease we experience when we're first learning something. It's how smoothly the information seems to be going into our brains. And retrieval fluency is that feeling of ease we experience when we're trying to recall something from memory. It's how quickly and effortlessly the information comes back to mind.
And both of these types of fluency can lead to these illusions of knowing.
Exactly. They both tap into that same basic principle. When something feels easy, we tend to assume we know it well. But as we've seen, that assumption can be dangerous.
The paper gives some really good examples of how encoding fluency can mislead us, like the spacing effect.
Oh, the spacing effect is a perfect example. We all know that spreading out our study sessions over time is more effective than cramming everything in at once. But cramming often feels more fluent in the moment. You're seeing the information repeatedly, so you get this sense of familiarity, and it feels like it's really sinking in.
And then, of course, you get to the test and it all falls apart.
Exactly, because that feeling of fluency was deceptive. You hadn't actually encoded the information deeply enough for it to stick in the long term. You were just fooling yourself with that feeling of familiarity.
And it's not just spacing, right? There are other examples where encoding fluency can lead us astray.
Absolutely. Another good example is the use of interactive imagery. When you create a vivid mental image to link two concepts together, it can feel like you've really nailed it. But the speed with which you can generate that image doesn't always correlate with how well you'll actually remember the information later on. It's that feeling of fluency in creating the image that can be misleading.
So even when we're using what seem like effective study strategies, we still need to be wary of that feeling of fluency.
Absolutely. And then there's the comparison between simply restudying material and actively testing yourself.
I think we've all been there, right? Staring at our notes, highlighting everything, feeling like we're making progress, but then we actually try to recall the information without looking, and it's like, uh-oh, where did it all go?
Exactly. And that's because restudying often feels more fluent than testing. You're just passively taking in the information, and it creates this sense of familiarity. But that familiarity doesn't necessarily translate into durable knowledge.
Whereas testing, even though it feels harder and less fluent in the moment, forces you to really engage with the material and try to retrieve it from memory, which is much more effective for long-term learning.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that students often realize this, at least intuitively. The paper mentions that many students quiz themselves primarily to see how well they've learned, but then they turn right back around and mistakenly believe that they actually learn more from just passively restudying.
So it's this weird disconnect between what we know we should be doing and what actually feels more effective in the moment.
And that's because we're so easily swayed by that feeling of fluency. We gravitate towards the things that feel easier and more familiar, even when we know, deep down, that they might not be the best for our learning.
Okay, so we've covered encoding fluency. Now, what about retrieval fluency? How does that feeling of ease when we're trying to remember something influence our confidence?
Retrieval fluency is all about how quickly and effortlessly we can access information from memory. And just like with encoding fluency, that feeling of ease can be incredibly seductive. If an answer pops into our heads right away, we naturally assume we've got it right.
But, as with encoding fluency, that feeling of ease isn't always a reliable indicator of accuracy.
Right. There are all sorts of factors that can influence how easily we retrieve information, and some of those factors have nothing to do with how well we actually know the material. For example, if we've encountered similar information recently, it might be easier to recall, even if it's not the correct answer to the current question.
The paper used a study about integrative ability to illustrate this point.
Oh, that's a good one. In that study, participants were given a word puzzle to solve. Those who solved it easily tended to rate their overall problem-solving abilities as being higher than those who struggled with the puzzle. But of course, their ability to solve that one specific puzzle wasn't necessarily a reliable indicator of their broader problem-solving skills. It was that feeling of fluency in solving the puzzle that influenced their self-assessment.
So it's like that ease of retrieval created this halo effect, making them feel more confident about their abilities in general.
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that sometimes trying to retrieve more information can actually decrease our confidence if the act of retrieval feels difficult.
That seems counterintuitive. If I can remember more things, shouldn't I feel more confident in my memory?
You'd think so, but the research suggests otherwise. The paper mentioned a study where people were asked to recall either 4 or 12 childhood events. Those who were asked to recall 12 events, even though they actually remembered more events in total, ended up feeling less confident in their memories overall.
So it was the effort involved in trying to retrieve those extra memories that
Yeah.
made them feel less confident.
Exactly. The difficulty of the retrieval process, even though it led to recalling more information, actually created a sense of doubt and uncertainty. It's like our brains are saying, well, if I'm having to work this hard to remember things, maybe my memory isn't that good after all.
Fascinating. And then there's the really tricky issue of retrieving information fluently but incorrectly.
Oh, that's a big one. Sometimes that feeling of fluency isn't actually connected to the correct answer at all. It might be based on a prior experience, a misconception, or just a general sense of familiarity. The paper gave an example of a general knowledge test where participants were more likely to confidently choose incorrect answers if those answers were related to the correct answer.
So it's like their brains were making these connections and saying, oh, this seems familiar, so it must be right.
Precisely. And this can happen even when we're trying to be really careful and deliberate in our thinking. The paper mentioned a study where participants were given anagrams to solve. Some of those anagrams were ones they had seen solved earlier, while others were new. And even though they were able to solve the previously seen anagrams much faster, they didn't attribute their speed to having seen the solution before. They just assumed those anagrams were inherently easier.
So their brains were misattributing the feeling of fluency to the task itself rather than to their prior experience.
Exactly. And this misattribution of fluency can have real consequences for our learning. It can lead us to believe we understand something when we really don't.
And it's not just direct experiences that can create this feeling of fluency. Even just being familiar with the cues associated with something can boost our confidence, even if those cues aren't actually helpful for recalling the information.
That's right. The paper mentions studies where simply repeating the cue word for a target word increased participants' confidence in their ability to recall the target word, even though the cue repetition didn't actually improve their memory.
So it's like we're mistaking that general feeling of familiarity for actual knowledge and understanding.
Precisely. And this can happen in all sorts of learning situations. The paper talked about how instructors, because of their expertise, can sometimes underestimate how difficult certain concepts or test questions will be for their students.
It's like they're so familiar with the material that they forget what it's like to be learning it for the first time.
Exactly. And on the student side, just being familiar with things like chapter headings or study questions can create a false sense of understanding and lead to poor decisions about how much more studying is needed.
So it's this complex interplay between our actual experiences and our beliefs about what those experiences mean that can really trip us up.
And that brings us to the role of beliefs in all of this. Our pre-existing beliefs about how learning works can significantly influence how we interpret these feelings of fluency.
For example, if you believe that simply reading a textbook chapter once is enough to master the material, you might feel overly confident after that initial read-through, even if you haven't actually absorbed the information deeply enough for it to stick.
Exactly. Your beliefs shape your expectations, and your expectations shape your experience. And the research on metacognitive beliefs, which are our beliefs about our own thinking processes, goes all the way back to studies with children.
Oh, right. The paper mentioned that older children tend to have more accurate beliefs about how memory works than younger children.
Exactly. They're more likely to understand things like the benefits of restudying material and the fact that the amount of material you're trying to learn affects how well you'll remember it.
And more recent research has looked specifically at our beliefs about processing fluency and how those beliefs can influence our confidence judgments.
That's right. The paper highlighted a fascinating study where participants were shown words in different font sizes. They were then asked to judge how well they would remember those words later. And what's really interesting is that their confidence judgments were influenced by their beliefs about how font size affects memory, even though those beliefs weren't necessarily accurate.
So even before they had any actual experience of trying to remember the words, their beliefs about how easily they should be able to remember them were already shaping their confidence levels.
Precisely. And this highlights how powerful beliefs can be. They can literally shape our perceptions of reality. And these beliefs about fluency also influence the study strategies we choose to use.
Like the belief in cramming, despite all the evidence showing that it's not an effective way to learn.
Exactly. That belief is likely reinforced by the feeling of fluency we experience during massed practice. We see the information repeatedly, so it feels familiar, and we assume we're learning it well. But as we've seen, that feeling of fluency is often deceptive.
And then there's the belief that simply rereading your notes is a more effective way to learn than actively testing yourself.
Right. That belief can lead students to spend hours highlighting their textbooks and rereading their notes, even though research shows that self-testing is far more effective for long-term retention.
And the belief that quick learning equals good learning seems particularly problematic.
Absolutely. That belief can lead to overconfidence, oversimplification of concepts, and ultimately poor test performance. It's essential to recognize that true understanding takes time and effort, and that feeling of fluency is not always a reliable indicator of deep learning.
So we've got this complex web of fluency experiences and beliefs about fluency that can really distort our perceptions of our own knowledge. And to make things even more complicated, the paper even delves into how our beliefs about intelligence itself can play a role in all of this.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting, especially for you as a learner. Our theories about intelligence, whether we tend to believe it's fixed or malleable, can really shape how we interpret the challenges we face when learning.
So if you believe that intelligence is basically set at birth, that you're either smart or you're not, You're more likely to see difficulty as a sign of your own limitations.
Exactly. And that can lead to decreased confidence and motivation when things don't come easily. You might even start to avoid challenges altogether, thinking, well, this is just too hard for me. I must not be smart enough.
Whereas if you have more of a growth mindset, you're more likely to see challenges as opportunities for learning and growth.
Precisely. And that can lead to increased resilience and persistence. You might think, okay, this is tough, but I know I can get better with effort and practice. And that belief can actually help you learn more effectively in the long run.
And the paper even touched on the concept of self-efficacy, particularly in areas like mathematics.
Right. Self-efficacy is basically your belief in your ability to succeed in a particular domain. And those beliefs can be heavily influenced by your past experiences and your beliefs about your own abilities. So if you struggled with math in the past and you believe that you're just not a math person, you might be less likely to put in the effort to improve, even if you actually could with the right support and strategies.
So it's not just about our general beliefs about learning, but also about our beliefs about our own capabilities in specific areas.
Exactly. And all of these beliefs about fluency, about learning, and about our own intelligence can interact in complex ways to shape our confidence levels and our learning outcomes.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture so far. It seems like our brains are practically wired to mislead us about what we know. But the paper does offer some hope, right? It suggests some strategies we can use to overcome these fluency biases.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot we can do to become more aware of these biases and to make more accurate judgments about our learning. The key is to move beyond that immediate gut level feeling of fluency and to engage in more deliberate analytical thinking.
So the first step is basically to slow down and question our initial reactions.
Exactly. Don't just assume that because something feels easy or familiar, you've got it down. Take a moment to reflect on the information, to test yourself, to consider alternative perspectives.
And the paper mentions some specific strategies we can use to challenge our initial judgments, like thinking about alternative outcomes or reasons why we might be wrong.
Right. By forcing ourselves to consider other possibilities, we can break free from that feeling of fluency and engage in more critical thinking. It can be as simple as asking yourself, what if my initial understanding is actually wrong? What evidence would support that?
Another interesting tactic was trying to relate current learning tasks to past experiences where our expectations didn't match up with reality.
That's a great way to learn from our mistakes. By consciously connecting a current situation to a previous one where we were overconfident and ended up performing poorly, we can become more calibrated in our self-assessments.
Though the paper did warn against thinking about too many alternative outcomes.
Right. If you find yourself struggling to come up with plausible reasons why you might be wrong, that difficulty itself can actually reinforce your initial confidence. So the key is to focus on generating a few easily accessible counter-arguments rather than trying to brainstorm an exhaustive list.
Another strategy discussed was focusing on the cues that are actually reliable indicators of learning rather than just that feeling of fluency.
Exactly. Instead of just asking yourself, does this feel familiar? Ask yourself, can I recall specific details? Can I explain this concept to someone else? Can I apply this knowledge in a new situation?
So it's about looking beyond that surface level of familiarity and really digging deeper into our understanding.
And the way we frame the evaluation task can also make a difference. The paper mentioned the childhood memories example again, where simply telling participants that the task would be difficult actually led to more accurate self-assessments.
So just being aware of the potential for difficulty can help us be more realistic in our expectations.
And of course, one of the most powerful tools we have for overcoming these fluency biases is feedback.
Feedback is essential, right? It gives us that objective information about our performance that we need to calibrate our confidence.
Exactly. Think about weather forecasters. They get constant feedback on the accuracy of their predictions, and as a result, they tend to be very well calibrated in their probability judgments. When we get feedback on our learning, whether it's from a test, an instructor, or even just from self-testing, it helps us see where our understanding is strong and where there are gaps.
The paper did point out that the benefits of feedback can vary depending on the context and the learner's developmental stage.
That's true. Feedback is most effective when it's specific, timely, and relevant to the task at hand. And younger learners might need more guidance on how to interpret and utilize feedback effectively.
Finally, the paper discusses the importance of addressing our underlying beliefs about fluency and intelligence.
Right. If we want to make lasting changes in how we approach learning, we need to challenge those ingrained beliefs that can lead us astray.
So instead of believing that learning should always feel easy and effortless, we need to embrace the idea that true understanding often requires effort, struggle, and even a bit of discomfort.
Exactly. And by fostering a growth mindset, we can learn to see challenges not as threats, but as opportunities for growth and development.
And this all ties back to the importance of metacognitive awareness, being mindful of our own thinking processes and understanding how our minds can sometimes trick us.
Absolutely. And this is especially important in today's learning environments, where we're often expected to be more self-directed and to take greater responsibility for our own learning.
So in essence, we need to become metacognitive detectives, always questioning our own assumptions and looking for clues that reveal the true state of our understanding.
Well said. And by doing so, we can become more effective, more resilient, and ultimately, more successful learners.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive into the complexities of confidence, fluency, and learning. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the next time you're studying and you feel that surge of confidence, just take a moment to pause, reflect, and ask yourself, is this feeling a reliable guide or is my brain playing tricks on me?
That's excellent advice. So to our listeners, as you reflect on your own learning experiences, can you think of any times when that feeling of fluency might have led you astray? What's one strategy we discussed today that you could try in your next learning endeavor to get a more accurate gauge of your actual understanding? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.